Hey everyone, welcome to the session on worker self-directed nonprofits and nonprofit unionizing. My name is Nick Caleb, and I'm a climate energy attorney at Breach Collective, joined by Danny Noonan from Breach Collective as well. And yeah, we're going to present to you on the virtues of unionizing and why you should democratize your workplace. So I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully. And can folks see this okay?
Yeah.
All righty. So how my screen is sharing right now, I basically can't see anybody else. Let me see if I can, okay, I see. All righty. So we're just gonna jump in. I might have to click out, or Danny might be able to admit people as they come into the room as well.
Yeah, I can handle that, Nick.
Thanks. Okay, awesome. So Breach Collective is a brand new nonprofit, and we just launched a few months ago in December after about a year of developing all of the things that you need to do to start a nonprofit. We started basically from two separate unionization efforts that were successful but had elements involved and led to conclusions that had staff at two different nonprofits thinking that they maybe didn't want to stay at the same organizations that they were at anymore, and opted to make a go of starting our own. And before we get to our story, I guess we might want to talk a little bit about why you would want to unionize in the first place. And I don't know, Danny, if you want to kick off and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, just as an introduction, I mean, as Nick mentioned, most of the people involved with Breach, actually, I think all of the people who are currently involved with Breach were also previously involved in unionization campaigns at nonprofits they used to work at. This is kind of reflective, I think, of a trend we're seeing, particularly in the United States at the moment, of nonprofit unionization. So this is an article from In These Times, which has been doing a lot of fantastic reporting on nonprofit unionization, probably the leading sort of publication on sort of covering this boom, as it's called here, or frenzy. But yeah, this is from May 2020, and it's talking about the fact that that nonprofit, particularly advocacy organizations, have been unionizing at a pretty rapid rate in the last few years. And I think the day this article doesn't capture efforts by Greenpeace USA, ACLU National is probably one of the biggest ones in the last few months, and also Animal Legal Defense Fund, which is currently the union there is currently resisting a pretty aggressive union busting campaign from their management. So that's the sort of context in which these discussions about democratizing your workplace are occurring. Nick, do you want to go to the next slide? But what we're hoping to talk to folks about today is diving a bit more into why this boom, or why this frenzy of nonprofit organizing, union organizing and unionization is happening, as well as sort of broader efforts to democratize and sort of challenge some of the hierarchies in union workplaces. So talking about sort of some of the motivations and trends and sort of systemic issues, structural issues that exist in the nonprofit sector that are leading to this. And then also shifting from that to talking about sort of in a very practical terms, you're a worker at a nonprofit, and you want to unionize your workplace, or at least you want to organize your fellow workers towards change. How do you go about doing that? Because one of the things that when my comrades and I at our old organization were looking to unionize. We had to do a lot of self-education. There weren't a lot of resources out there, particularly tailored to the nonprofit experience. So we'll talk a little bit about the sort of steps you take and some of the things to look out for. And then I want to sort of pivot to the other sort of trend of nonprofit democratization, if you will, that's going on at the moment, which is worker self-direction or collectivization. Essentially the sort of non-profit version of a cooperative. Give a little bit of an overview about that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is Breach's model, which is a unionized worker self-directed nonprofit, basically taking elements of unionized nonprofit workplaces and worker self-directed or collectivized workplaces and sort of fusing them together with the hopes of getting the best of both worlds. So we'll talk a little bit about how we developed that model, what the inspiration is, and how it's worked in practice so far. And then after that, we'll just open it up to questions and answers. Nick, if it works for you, I'll just start off on sort of the reasons for democratizing the workplace. And then if you just want to jump in with some insights that you have, we can just sort of go back and forth. That works.
Sounds great.
Great. So this is another article that I've just linked to from In These Times. That sort of, I thought these quotes anyway sort of captured sort of the problem and then the solution that unions offer. So anyone who's worked in nonprofits for a number of years is probably familiar with, if not directly, then at least indirectly, the sort of issues that exist in nonprofits around burnout, around being sort of under-resourced, underpaid, nonprofits being sort of understaffed for what they've agreed to take on in terms of projects, and therefore you sort of feeling overworked and underappreciated as a result, and often having to sort of cover multiple roles and be expected to sort of deal with unmanageable deadlines and things like that, all for salaries or wages that typically are much less than you could get for similar working conditions in the for-profit sector. So that's one issue, and we'll talk about a few other issues that exist with the non-profit sector and what's sometimes called the non-profit industrial complex. But as this article notes, unions are a way to sort of work with your co-workers, build power amongst them, and negotiate with management to address these issues that you wouldn't have the same power or ability to, and you wouldn't have the same legal protection to try and change individually. I think a lot of people are familiar with sort of having a discussion with a manager or your boss or your ED about issues in the workplace, and either have being shut down completely, or at least sort of at best sort of getting lip service in response to those issues, and being told, well, that's just the way things are, or we can't do it any other way. And unions give you a way to sort of collectively argue for a better way of doing things in your workplace. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, and I might just add a little bit here. In terms of background, there's a lot of different experiences that folks can have at nonprofits. Some nonprofits are like large and like really bureaucratized, and will have like HR departments and things like that, which probably gives a much different experience. My previous experience has always been working at much smaller nonprofits, and I would say that there's some advantage to having like smaller informal kind of relations, and things seem a little bit more flexible, and those things were always attractive to me. But I always had union organizer friends kind of told me, even at like smaller nonprofits, you guys should unionize. And I was like, well, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. I have a lot of control. But it's really true. The power dynamics are still there, even if they're sort of hidden. You still have bosses, you still have workers, you still have some people that are in control of the finances, and others that are sort of like at-will employees, which basically means that in most states, your boss can fire you for basically no reason, to say organizationally that we want to do this. And when things go sour, they may be great forever, but as soon as they go sour, you may be in a position where you don't have any protections. And that was something that happened to me, and I started to feel really vulnerable right around the time that my colleagues and I were going to unionize at a nonprofit that we were at before. And unionization really does change that dynamic. It really, one of the base protections that you get out of the union is you get your local gets to kind of represent you in any kind of like disciplinary matters. Things are far more organized. We were sort of thinking about using unionization as like instilling more structure into our nonprofit because we were tired of the informalities and wanted to have more predictability around like schedules and timing and being asked to do things in weird places. Also, unions can help with diversity, equity, inclusion issues. I was at a very white nonprofit that was resistant to DEI trainings and wouldn't put money into it. And the staff were starting to get really frustrated with that because not only was it bad for internal politics, but it was bad from a standpoint of like wanting to recruit talent into our organization. And so we attempted to use unionization in order to kind of like bring forward some of the democracy and the values that we wanted to see in the workplace. So it's not just it's not just like a fanciful thing that you might want to do just so you can give yourself a gold star. It really does mean a change in power dynamics within your organization.
And so a lot of those issues that Nick just touched on are sort of also mentioned on this slide, just sort of categorically. Founder syndrome, which is the sort of first bullet on this slide, is it's a pretty vague term. There is some sort of academic literature on it, but there's a number of different definitions and ways of sort of thinking about founder syndrome. Some sort of reject that it's really an issue, and some think it's sort of the overarching issue. And I probably fall into the latter camp. And it's not always a founder. Sometimes it's just an executive director. But I think particularly with small nonprofits, the ED or the founder or the board president, and sometimes an individual can hold all of those roles at once, has a lot of power. Often the mission or idea for creating the nonprofit was their own, and then they sort of have a deep sort of personal investment in trying to and having built up their nonprofit to the point where they have staff and pursuing their mission and their sort of own sort of theory of change. I think often you could argue that within the nonprofit sector, a lot of these EDs are white people with something of a sort of savior complex associated with them. And basically that produces a number of sort of different workplace pathologies. But basically the main issue is that and this is what the literature says, is that basically the founder sort of doesn't see any sort of separation between themselves as a person and the organization. And so they feel that they're entitled to direct their organization as they see fit. They don't really there's sort of a resistance to change, as this definition notes, and a sort of resistance to sort of structure and decision-making processes, and any sort of sense that, what the founder thinks is best for the nonprofit and what actually might be best for the nonprofit are two separate concepts. Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's a difference between them. So if you have a founder who's running a nonprofit sort of like their own personal fiefdom, then that can produce a number of different issues. And these issues can include and can be present in the absence of founder syndrome, mismanagement of resources. So whether that's spending gratuitous amounts of money on travel, or not budgeting properly, or putting allocation towards sort of pet projects rather than sort of staff wages and benefits and things like that. There's different ways in which resources can be mismanaged. There's also often a lack of transparency around that, which the collective bargaining process addresses. We can talk a little bit about why that is when we get to the talking about how to unionize your workplace. As Nick mentioned, some big nonprofits have HR departments and things like that, and that may give you a bit more sort of structure to address issues in the workplace. Small nonprofits usually don't have that. They often will have sort of dispute resolution policies that basically say, talk to your supervisor or talk to your boss, even though that's the person that has all the authority, all the hiring and firing power. You're their at-will employee. And so if you do have an issue with, and if they're the problem, you know, talking to them directly might just get you fired. It might not actually lead to a sort of constructive process. So not having a dispute resolution mechanism can be an impetus for unionizing. Workplace discrimination is a really good case study that we looked at a lot at my old organization, which was the because this great story from Jezebel happened to drop right around the time that sort of we're about to launch our union, which involves the National Centre for Transgender Equality. And their co-founders or co-EDs and sort of how they treated BIPOC staff and things like that. So I recommend checking out that link and checking out that article. There's a lot of really sort of illustrative lessons there about not only what the sort of issues are, but, you know, what can go wrong when you try to address them without a union in place. As Nick mentioned, you know, sort of the flip side of just sort of outright discrimination is sort of lack of processes to promote, you know, staff diversity and anti-oppression and things like that. And we're seeing this at the moment with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. They're stated that their unions stated motivation for unionizing includes a very sort of weak kind of milquetoast response to the Black Lives Matter movement, as we sort of can recall. Shortly after the sort of George Floyd protests erupted, I think just about every nonprofit in the country sent an email to their member list talking about how they supported the movement for Black Lives in various ways. Some of these were more tone deaf than others, but I think the sort of the tone deafness of ALDF's message has been cited by its employees as a basis for wanting to unionize. So I'd definitely check out that article as well if you're sort of interested in these issues, or, you know, interested in organizing your workplace and want to sort of anticipate some of the problems that'll pop up.
And just adding to what Danny said, I think there's just like parts of a nonprofit structure in general that lead to a lot of these problems. It's not just accident or individuals, right? It's the design and history of the nonprofit sector kind of popping up in a lot of ways, at least as it relates to activists and people that do more social change advocacy. It's a structure that was adopted pretty much in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, became more of a popular structure right around the same time that kind of the global economy was undergoing a massive sort of reorientation toward financialization, and the public sector was kind of being, you know, scaled back across the developed world at the same time. And so this is kind of a way of, it's not just a way, I mean, it's great if you can do it well to have like these organizations that can do advocacy, but they are at the, you know, they're also disciplinary structures internally and is like a wide social construct. And so if we want to work in these structures and be able to push back on that a little bit, you know, having democracy in the workplace and unions is a way of sort of like fighting against the tendency toward kind of defanging our movements in a lot of ways as well. So I think there's like a movement necessity around unionization as well. And yeah, I just from probably Danny too, like when you talk about this stuff, there's a lot of sort of like trauma that comes back from like bad experiences with bosses, and you start to remember a lot of how this works. I mean, Danny and I both have legal training and sort of are in a position of probably like more social power maybe than like people without go to law school and things like that. And still, you know, with knowing that there's legal recourse, knowing that there are different ways of going outside of the nonprofit, potentially using employment law, it's still extraordinarily stressful to try to ask for things within your nonprofit structure. And unless you have a group of people with you and a legal structure of protection, really the nicest seeming nonprofit boss in the world can just say no to you, right? And that's just how it goes for the most part. And so I think in the medium to long term, unionization is also a good way of like managing disputes in that way, because it sets expectations clearly. People understand how power is distributed. You have formal processes. And so it does have sort of like an evening out, even if you're not into the collectivization stuff that we are at Breach, which we'll talk about. It still has a sort of like moderating impact on a lot of the potential for nonprofits to break up.
Yeah, I'd just say that there was two more points on that side, and it's all good. And I just want to cover those quickly because I think most people, if they're not sort of nodding their heads along, they at least sort of understand what I mean when I say, lack of consistent decision-making processes and mission creep. I mean, a great example of this is the sort of bottlenecking that tends to occur in small nonprofits. And what I mean by bottlenecking is, you'll be working as a team on something, with your co-workers, and you'll produce a report or you'll reach a decision or something like that, and then you'll need approval from your executive director. But so does every other sort of team in the organization need approval from the executive director to actually, send out that email or publish that report or make that decision. And it all just sort of gets funneled through a very sort of narrow and decision-making process, decision maker. And as Nick sort of alluded to, they can just say no, and they don't really have to give much of a reason for it. And there's not really sort of a process that decision maker needs to follow. It's all just sort of being funneled through one person. And then factionalism is probably one of the more toxic things that can happen, but that's when, your nonprofit managers sort of play favorites and prefer certain classes of employees over others and give them sort of favorable treatment and stuff as a way of sort of currying favor and loyalty and sort of treat other employees as expendable. And that is a pretty common thing as well, and can be remediated or at least regulated somewhat by unionizing.
Yeah, and then maybe just kind of like to round this out, everybody knows about the kind of pressures in the nonprofit world as it relates to, an expectation that kind of like doing meaningful work. And so you should be open to sort of like working longer hours or working harder. And this is an expectation that's oftentimes sort of encouraged by bosses, but is also sort of self-imposed. And it's just sort of a thing that we come to believe that if we do work that's in this sort of like social justice realm, that we should be more sacrificing of ourselves. And I think, individuals make their own decisions about that kind of stuff, but like it can turn into a structural expectation really quickly. And unions are a way of adding protection and support so that people can avoid the burnout that we talked about, and they can avoid the abuse that can come with those sorts of expectations.
Great. So those are some of the issues that commonly exist in and motivate unionizing campaigns within nonprofits. I'm now going to, I think maybe Nick and I can sort of switch off on this, but sort of talk about the process of unionizing your workplace. And when we talk to people at other workplaces who don't know sort of where to start, this is basically what we tell them, is sort of the steps to unionizing. So the first one is a kind of power mapping exercise within your own workplace. And I remember when we unionized, we sat down at one of our co-workers' houses and we basically just went around the room and said, no pressure here, no expectations, but if we're going to do this, we need to see what level of sort of commitment and energy there is within staff to do it. So, rate yourself on a sort of 1 to 5 as to, how bought in to the idea of unionizing you are. And I think that day there was probably only a couple of ones, as in 1 being the most, you could do it either way, but 1 being sort of the most energized and the most invested in unionizing, and 5 being the least. I think most people were sort of self-assessing themselves as a 2 to 3. But we ended up having sort of a core group of 5 people who probably answered all different ways that day, but sort of within a week or two were sort of like, I'm a 1, you know, I want to see this happen. And that's what became our organizing committee, which is sort of, you know, you sort of need the individuals who have bought in to unionizing them the most sort of need to organize amongst themselves and just break down the roles. And a lot of that is sort of having conversations with your co-workers about unionizing, about the issues they're experiencing, and sort of seeing if you can get them to sort of buy into the idea that that unionization is the way to address the issues in the workplace. Nick, do you have anything to comment on those first 2 steps?
Yeah, I would say this is the time to be most careful about what you're doing, because it's the time in the unionizing process when you're most vulnerable, basically, is when you're getting started up. And it's common tactic for, you know, anything that's sort of like counter to what a union, counter to a union effort, will just refer to as shorthand as union busting. And there are many, many tools that have developed a lot, I mean, primarily in the private workplace and then sort of imported into the nonprofit workplace with surprising efficiency. I think all of us are a bit surprised to find out how eager our nonprofit bosses are to union bust because of the social justice kind of stuff that hangs over a lot of this work. But yeah, you're very vulnerable. And so you want to be, you know, relationships of trust, especially here, and understandings of confidentiality and all the rest, because if your boss catches wind too early before you're ready to go, they'll let you go for, you know, some kind of random reason that, if they're smart enough, at least, they won't ever mention anything about the labor. You just be let go, and then, you know, you don't get unionized anymore because you have a job. So there's a risk for sure.
Yeah, it's a risk every step of the process, and then it's, you know, but it's probably its biggest when you're sort of least organized and least sort of, you know, you could say, you know, you've yet to sort of build sufficient solidarity amongst your employees that, you know, you're still wondering if you're sort of going to be left out in the cold by trying to unionize your workplace. Although I'd say, you know, by and large, at least in my experience, even, you know, if your workplace, I think all nonprofits should unionize. I think unions should be universal in workplaces. That's sort of my political position. But, you know, I think even for people who think that unions are more trouble than they're worth, or don't sort of see the benefits to them, or don't have the same issues that maybe are sort of widely held within the workplace, they can usually understand when you talk to them about, you know, what the issues you're having and why you might resort to unionization, and they're sort of at least passively supportive, if not sort of actively supportive. At least that was my experience in the past. But yeah, returning to the steps. So once you have sort of an organizing committee, there's a number of tasks that you need to sort of work on. One of which we talked about is talking to your fellow co-workers, particularly those who maybe, you know, sort of in my experience, you know, union conversations sort of arise organically, and people may be left out of that conversation initially for a host of reasons. But sort of, you know, you need to make sure that you reach out to everyone who you think isn't going to run directly to management, at least, and just sort of have an initial conversation with them, and then sort of have follow-up conversations, and just really, you know, kind of classic organizing work of just sort of building relationships with people, deepening those relationships, you know, getting sort of buy-in to a concept or idea. But in addition to that, you also need to think about who's going to represent you. And this can be difficult, particularly at small nonprofit shops, because probably the 2 biggest nonprofit sector unions, which is the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union and the Progressive Workers Union, I wouldn't say they're only interested in large shops, but I would say that's where most of their attention is focused as unions. So, and I think one of them, I'm forgetting which one at the moment, is volunteer run. So, you know, they're workers at other nonprofits who also, you know, spend their time helping other nonprofits unionize, and they represent Sierra Club, Greenpeace USA, Union of Concerned Scientists, ACLU, those, and these are sort of national organizations with hundreds of employees, if not more. and there's a sort of financial benefit in terms of dues to organizing those shops that doesn't necessarily exist for, you know, your 5-person nonprofit or your 20-person nonprofit, or, you know, even sort of mid-sized ones may not, you know, the investment of resources there may not be worth it. But there are nonprofits like CWA, who both Nick's old workplace and my old workplace unionized with, who will take on those smaller shops. And I think there'll be more and more of that over time. So, you know, reaching out early, having those initial discussions early and seeing if they're willing to represent you and help you get organized is a big thing to tick off if you're going to have a successful campaign. So, Nick, do you have anything to add?
You can always reach out to us at Reach, and we're always happy to help connect with folks. And it's like shopping a little bit. You might have a couple conversations. Like, everyone in that sector will understand the confidentiality, so you can be pretty clear that, you know, somebody in one union, if you don't go with them, they're not going to like whisper about your campaign to somebody else. I did want to mention one thing that overlooked is the world of kind of Zoom land that we live in right now, in pandemic world. It's a little bit different than it would be if you were like in building in place with folks. And just so it's, I mean, maybe it doesn't even need to be said sometimes, but never use your work emails for organizing or any kind of infrastructure that your bosses have control over or could like sort of like come across your messages and things like that. So Signal groups are really good for texting, private emails. If you're really worried, you could go with like some encryption, but just keeping everything away from your workplace infrastructure when you're organizing is important.
Yeah. And so one of the other steps your committee would be working on is number 4, which is sort of preparing your public facing campaign. And Caitlin, who's on the call, did a really great job of helping with this at our old organization. But it's things like, you wouldn't launch these things until you're ready to actually launch a union, but, you know, you'd start thinking about, okay, well, like, what are we going to call ourselves? What's the name for our union? What is our logo, if we want to have a nice logo? You know, these things sort of help in sort of helping draw attention and support to your campaign, which helps put pressure on management to recognize, which we'll talk about in a second. You know, what's our Twitter account? What's our messaging? You know, when we decide we're unionizing, you know, what's the story we're telling about why we're doing this? Those are the sorts of things you start to work on. And as we noted here, and earlier, you know, do everything in your power to keep your campaign a secret, to keep the idea that unionizing a secret until you're ready to go public. Because once you do go public, you need to immediately after going public, you need to be ready for your sort of inoculation and union busting response. So, Nick, do you want to add anything?
Some places there are, like in the Pacific Northwest, we have labor publications that are really favorable and friendly to small and large shops that are unionizing. And so I think at Danny and Caitlin's former employer, and then also at mine, we had a lot of support in getting our message out from favorable labor press. And so that might be similar to unions. And sometimes your union that you choose to work with will also have those connections for you. And sometimes they may be your own, but kind of like also thinking really in the same way that you would do like issue advocacy in a nonprofit, you will apply those same tools to thinking about union advocacy and press and getting your press releases, getting your press contacts and all that. Because really, like, when we get to this stage here, you're starting to set up to like pressure your bosses into giving you what you want. Like, that's ultimately now where you're going.
Yeah, I think building lists of allies as well is important. So if you know, managers even at other nonprofits who are supportive of unionization, or board members at other nonprofits, or funders, typically those first categories aren't going to be super supportive, but, you know, staff at other nonprofits, unions, local businesses, if you have good personal relationships with any of them and they would sort of understand what you're doing, you know, you probably aren't going to reach out to them until you go public, but you want to start building the list of who you're going to reach out to and request for support. And you're going to want to have something like a template letter or email that they can send on, or even a tweet. I've seen ALDF do a great job of sort of having template tweets and sort of having people tag their ED and say, hey, recognize union, what are you doing? Nick's old organization did a great job of that as well. But yeah, making sure that, when you do go public, there's immediate pressure on management to recognize. And I guess that takes us to the next step in the process, which is submitting or communicating your intention to unionize to management and requesting voluntary recognition. And just as a sort of quick legal lesson in how labor relations work in this country, the National Labor Relations Act, basically there's two main ways that you'll be recognized. The first is that management just says, yep, we agree to recognize you. They sort of sign a document with the union and they pass a board resolution or whatever, and then you have union and you go into collective bargaining. If they say, no, we won't do voluntary recognition, then you have an election. And so you file for an election with the National Labor Relations Board, and you sort of negotiate with management on the sort of terms of that election. Sometimes it's a vote, and sort of usually by mail, or sometimes they'll have an in-person voting place, at least in pre-COVID times. They'll send out, letters, and you'll submit and this and that. Or there's a card check. And this is something I forgot to mention too, is that when you're having conversations with your employees prior to launching a union campaign, if they're committed, if they're all in to join the union, you want to have them sign a card, which is basically, I agree to be represented at my organization by this union. And your local will provide sort of the cards for that. Generally, you... Oh, go ahead, Nick.
I would just say, like, this is a really important step because, and at my former workplace, we had some issues here, which I'll talk about more in a second, but basically you work directly with the union they'll distribute cards and then you will sign them and send them back. And it makes a lot of sense to kind of document everything that's going on really, really well, because one of the ways that you can challenge a union at the National Labor Relations Board is to basically, the employer can allege that a ineligible employee was the person who was organizing the union. And this is a common union busting strategy. So in my case, I was a attorney at my former workplace, and my employers just said that I was a manager. And then manager under the National Labor Relations Act is not allowed to be in the union. And therefore, I don't think I was a manager, but that was a way that they were able to like lodge some stuff at the NLRB and slow things down a little bit. So if you have all that stuff documented, then you save yourself any kind of headaches around that.
Yeah, there's a couple additional points of detail, which just kind of underline the fact that this is complicated stuff, and you definitely want to have lots of conversations and take lots of notes with the people you talk to before you sort of embark on this. But one of which is sort of defining your bargaining unit. So, but usually managers, supervisors, I think there's one other category, contractors are usually typically excluded from a union under the National Labor Relations Act. And those typically tend to be people with hiring and firing power. Contractors obviously aren't that, but that's there's a few other legal definitions for that, but usually that's the sort of the baseline definition. So when you are starting to figure out, okay, how are we going to build support for the union, you want to have a sort of a clear idea of what your bargaining unit is, who you need support from and who you need votes from. And some people might be sort of in a gray area, so you want to sort of think about, well, how many people do we need to support the union in an election if they are included in the unit, or how many people do we need if so-and-so is excluded because they're going to argue they're a manager or something like that. And these things actually get resolved before the National Labor Relations Board if it does come to an election and the union and management don't agree. But typically you want like a supermajority of your fellow co-workers or comrades in the bargaining unit to have already signed cards before you go public. It's usually around sort of like 70% or something like that. And that has a lot of benefits from a sort of campaign perspective, because you can sort of launch, you can have everyone's signature on the letter declaring to intend to unionize, and you can basically show management right off the bat that, you know, the overwhelming majority of staff, you know, support unionization. You're not going to be able to sort of, you know, change one or two people's minds and have them, you know, and kill the union that way, bust the union. Although some places will still try to do that. So once you launch, once you submit your intent to unionize and request voluntary recognition, management will either say yes, or sometimes they'll try sort of delaying tactics. But what they normally do is they'll hire legal counsel. It's not always like the most notorious union busting firm in Portland or something like that, just as a hypothetical example. But you know, that they will usually hire some kind of legal counsel to sort of advise them on how to respond to the union. And one of the tactics is delay, but there's a whole host of tactics that sort of, you know, fall more or less squarely within the concept of union busting. So what you want to do is you want to be ready to go to an election if management is looking to delay sort of for reasons that aren't, you know, obviously reasonable. And you also want to be prepared for union busting tactics. So we talk about this as inoculation. So one of the things we did was sort of, you know, basically sort of put together sort of a chart that basically said, management might say this, like non-profit workers can't unionize. This is what the law says. This is how you should respond. And the response is usually talk to my union rep. You know, like you're not supposed, under the National Labor Relations Act, you're not really, it's a bit of a gray area, but you're not really supposed to be sort of going directly to employees and saying, hey, you know, you're not allowed to do this or you shouldn't do this. You know, you're supposed to, once you go public, it's supposed to, communication is supposed to be directed through your union representative. I know ALDF right now is dealing with a lot of captive audience meetings, which, at least when I looked it up, seem to be sort of technically somehow legal at the moment. They used to be unlawful, but the court cases on that have changed. But that's another sort of thing that might happen, which is, you know, they get everyone in a room and say, hey, you know, this is why unions are a bad idea. This is why, you know, and try to sort of persuade people that way to not support the union anymore. When we're talking about unions getting outside counsel, there's a lot of things that they will try to do to undermine the power of the union. One of which is sort of announce layoffs or restructuring or sort of change in strategic direction for the organization, which is sort of your, you know, surface level, you know, superficially sort of a bona fide reason for doing things like laying off staff or offering people severances and things like that. But usually, you know, if you look at sort of who they're laying off and who they're offering severances to, you know, have the sort of the underlying goal of undermining the union. And I don't know if Nick wants to talk more about that.
Yeah, and this can be, a lot of it depends on the success of a strategy like that, is if the organization was actually, like, prior to unionization looking into some kind of restructuring and can actually document that. If they can, they might be able to get away with that. But in the case of my former employer, they announced a restructuring kind of like after we had unionized, and if we wanted to like go the distance probably and fight that, I'm quite sure we would have won at the National Labor Relations Board. It's important to know that for a lot of unions, including like CWA, Communication Workers of America, our local has just a great attorney that works out of Colorado and kind of supports the national. And so we had a lot of like, you know, even for a small bargaining unit, we had a lot of touch from attorneys who were like helpful for us along the way. And if you do the kind of front end organizing well, and you build a lot of cohesion among your employees, and you're like, you know, coming together and talking regularly, and you're communicating about, you know, the overtures and communications you get from your boss, you can definitely outmaneuver them, even if they've got, you know, expensive lawyers and things like that. But it really is just like all organizing, right? It's like if you build those bonds early and you make sure you have all the infrastructure, you're going to be far more resilient in the face of pushbacks, which sometimes they will come. I mean, basically in my former situation, we had unanimous support of employees, and our bosses still fought us. And, you know, like, so those are things that also I would say you can make best guesses and try to guess how your management will respond to stuff like this, but there's no way of fully controlling it. When we launched our public ask for voluntary recognition, we were very just like nice. Basically, we were like, hey, we're a social justice nonprofit. We love unions already. Like, this is going to help us work with the labor movement or on all the environmental things that we want to work on. We, just want to have a little bit more structure in this way, and like very, very nice, very like playing to our strengths, what we thought were playing to like the personality characteristics of management. And it's just like, they took it super as an attack on them and wanted to fight us all the way. And there's no real way to like totally control from that, but you're protected. As soon as you announce this intention, as soon as you file those cards, like, people cannot retaliate against you in the same way. Your union can file charges at your employer if they intimidate you, and put those on the books at the National Labor Relations Board, and they'll have hearings about them. And so there, suddenly, as soon as you announce to unionize, you have a lot more tools. If your employer won't negotiate with you in good faith, you can do strikes, you can do all sorts of things, and you have just more tools at your disposal and protections.
Yeah, and just one more point on that before we move on. If you have your union, one thing managers might do is they may recognize the union, but then they may sort of then announce restructuring or layoffs, sort of as a kind of, we're not going to sort of openly fight the union, but we might, try and change the way the workplace looks, and is structured to sort of, I guess, counter the sort of growing power of the union effort. Not saying that this necessarily happened at my old workplace, but what we did have was a restructuring announced after the union was recognized. And one of the benefits of unionization is you get to enter into what's called effects bargaining. And this is before you do your sort of collective bargaining agreement, where you negotiate wages and benefits and conditions of work and things like that. But it's a way of negotiating the effects between workers and staff of things like layoffs and voluntary severance agreements. And so they made they laid off some individuals. They changed the sort of job title and said you can either take this new job title and description of your work and role, or you can accept a voluntary severance. And they also had a universal voluntary severance. In other words, they offered everyone in staff basically, hey, if you don't like these structural changes, you can leave. We got to negotiate the terms of that severance agreement in terms of how much the pay was and things like that, and ended up getting some really beneficial terms and good sized payouts to a number of individuals who were laid off and accepted that severance. And this all occurred in December, so some of the individuals who were laid off were very stressed about being able to afford presents for their kids and stuff for Christmas. It was a pretty emotional time, but we were able to sort of, through the effects bargaining process, get the best deal we could for them. Whereas if the union was not in the workplace and they decided to do something like that, we would have just had to have taken the terms that management offered. So that's another, even if you don't get exactly what you want through unionization, there's often other sort of additional protections and benefits you get there. Well, do you want to go to the next slide, Nick, if you don't have anything to add? All right, so that's unionization. I do want to sort of shift the discussion towards worker self-direction, which is sort of one of the other sort of trends we're seeing in the nonprofit sector, particularly in the United States at the moment. And one of the reasons you might go down the worker self-direction path, whether this is not sort of mutually exclusive from unionization, you can have both, and this might be one of the things you actually advocate for as part of the unionizing and collective bargaining process. But, you know, as Nick sort of mentioned, you know, unionizing regulates and sort of, you know, puts a sort of structure and processes in place for dealing with workplace issues, but it often doesn't really redistribute power between managers and workers. And it sort of maintains that sort of manager-worker, you know, distinction and duality. And as long as you sort of have bosses, it was actually something my dad told me when I was involved in the unionizing effort. He said, yeah, you know, as long as you have a boss, you're going to have, you know, abuses of power, you know, and you're going to have sort of power dynamics that are inherent in, you know, people being put hierarchically in a position above others. You know, I'm sounding like Murray Bookchin or something right now, but, you know, that's sort of unavoidable, and unionization helps alleviate that, it helps regulate that, but it doesn't, you know, sort of get at the heart of the issue. And as I said, politically, I think every workplace should be unionized. So it's not a critique of unionization, it's just acknowledging the reality of it. Worker self-direction is a way of sort of restructuring your workplace to operate without managers. So an obvious example of this from sort of for-profit sector is, you know, food co-ops and other types of cooperatives. But the idea is to take those sort of principles and apply them to nonprofits. So the ideas here are sort of democratized and decentralized decision-making, and sort of maximum worker autonomy and ability to sort of set your hours, your sort of terms of work, and the projects you want to work on and the roles you want to take on. And there's a wealth of information about worker self-direction thanks to the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is a nonprofit based out of Oakland, California. They have a bunch of publicly available information, slideshows, manuals, board guides, etc., that describe this model, describe how it works in their workplace and how it could work in your workplace, talk about the sort of the legal requirements for it and some of the other features that they have and sort of how it operates for them. So very much recommend checking their website out. And they've also fostered this nonprofit democracy network, which I believe PowerShift Network is a member, and it includes not just, you know, organizations that, you know, closely follow the sort of worker self-direction model that exists at Sustainable Economies Law Center, which I'll just call SELC. But it also includes, you know, different types of workplace collectives. So 350 Seattle is an example. I think there's a number of others, and PowerShift does have a sort of non-hierarchical workplace structure, as best I understand it, for their staff. And that's sort of a process they went under a few years ago. Nick, I'm about to transition to talking about our model. So did you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Not here.
Great. We'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's another way to do it. And, you know, as we mentioned sort of at the beginning, Breach Collective was sort of founded after a unionization campaign at another nonprofit. And the people who founded it, you know, left that nonprofit and said, well, you know, in part because we sort of didn't believe that we were going to get some of the sort of structural changes that we wanted at that nonprofit, and that, you know, if we wanted to continue doing the kind of work we were doing and sort of pursuing a similar mission, we were going to have to come up with it ourselves. And I think, you know, that's probably the easiest way to affect this kind of structural change, is just to start from square one. But there are numerous constraints on starting your own nonprofit: time, resources, legal hoops to jump through, etc. So I'm not saying everyone should go off and start their own thing. There's probably too many nonprofits in the world, or at least the United States. So not necessarily advocating for a huge proliferation of them. And I think, you know, in certain workplaces, this is something that you could sort of push towards, you know, if you have a strong enough workforce and a receptive enough management. But we were sort of thinking about how to have a sort of collectivized workplace structure, and also where, you know, managers were unnecessary or sort of only really sort of filled a nominal role, while also having the sort of protections that a unionized workplace gives you legally. I mean, one of the things about cooperatives and collectives is, I wouldn't say they operate in a legal gray area, but historically they've been such a sort of minority of workplace structures, either in the for-profit or non-profit sector, that there hasn't been these sort of legal protections that are sort of built up around them. A lot of the sort of law for worker protection in this country sort of assumes a sort of hierarchical workplace of supervisors and employees and managers and things like that. So it was one of the problems we were sort of trying to figure out. And when we were talking to our union at the time, they said we were sort of sharing these ideas with them, and they said, "Oh, you mean sort of like a non-profit co-op?" And we're like, "Well, yeah." And so we sort of communicated with them over time, and as we were developing Breach Collective, sort of we're circling back with them and saying, "Hey, do you have any resources on this? Do you have any ideas of how this would work?" And they shared with us some information about the Mondragon model, which comes from the for-profit sector. And arises out of these sort of manufacturing and other co-ops that developed in the Basque region, and they are unionized for-profit cooperatives. Structurally, the way they work essentially is everyone is a worker owner, so they have a sort of equal share in the profits of the company, and they elect both a union committee, essentially a bargaining committee, and also they elect their board of directors. So it's all democratic. Everyone has one vote, and they'll choose their board of directors. They'll choose among themselves a certain number of individuals to serve on the board and a certain number of individuals to serve on the bargaining committee. The board of directors does appoint management, but they're sort of accountable to the workers as a whole, and they can be sort of, voted out by the workers as a whole. And the union committee that's elected by the workers as a whole will enter into bargaining with management or the board of directors or both, depending on the particular workplace, around sort of wages, benefits, conditions of work, et cetera. And so we liked this kind of idea and sort of the way to sort of work structurally, but realized that there were sort of certain changes that would need to occur for it to be adapted to non-profits. And I'll just note that I've included a recent New York Times article that sort of describes the Mondragon model as it operates in the Basque region. There's at least one such unionized co-op in the US that's represented by the United Steelworkers. I forget what they're called. I was reading about them last night, but we sort of took their materials and sort of adapted some of them. And then the other source of inspiration was, of course, the Sustainable Economies Law Center's worker self-directed model, and really sort of drawing on a lot of their publicly available resources. And this was a big inspiration for us because it was a existing nonprofit that operates by these principles and has done so successfully and is confident enough to sort of share all their information about how to do it. So the idea is that, you have management, but they don't, but what you really have is you have sort of a general sort of governance circle that's sort of made up of all the employees, or at least all of the employees who wish to be involved in those sorts of decisions. But then each of your sort of programs and your projects and your initiatives and campaigns sort of operate semi-autonomously, where they're sort of interacting with staff as a whole. But decision making is decentralized. It's sort of confined within the people working within that on that project or campaign, and sort of we sort of think about this as different kinds of circles. There's also movable roles, so people can either, the sort of structurally is designed so that people, have open conversations about how they feel about a particular role they're in. They can sort of move between roles if they're not feeling happy about it, about their current role or position, and they can sort of their job descriptions aren't overly prescribed to the point where they can't be like, oh, I'd like to take this on, and can I start doing more of this? Can I start doing more of fundraising or something like that? And This is, you can sort of see this in contrast to sort of management saying, you know, oh, hey, like, we're super busy. Can you take this on? Can you take this additional task on? You know, it's sort of more of a sort of autonomously being like, oh, I actually really enjoy doing this. I'm going to volunteer to take more of this on, is the kind of model. And then I've noted that the work self-directed nonprofit model is effected by a board resolution, which basically means that the board says, you know, based on the skills of its workers, the policies they have in place for worker self-direction, et cetera, we agree to essentially delegate a lot of the day-to-day decision-making for operating the organization to the workers, but we'll sort of retain oversight in these areas. And that's sort of getting into the legal issues associated with worker self-directed nonprofits, but basically the board still has to maintain sort of ultimate oversight, but there's a lot of their sort of decision making and authority they can actually delegate to workers. And we liked this, but we wanted to avoid a situation where boards do this and then can just, you know, have another resolution that basically says, oh, actually, no, we're taking all the power back and we're going to run like a sort of old school neoliberal nonprofit. And so that's why we thought we'd bring unionization into that Sustainable Economies Law Centre worker self-directed model. And if we go to the next slide, I'll be able to give a visual sort of representation of how that works. I did a little bit of work to update this last night, but this is essentially something we came up with sort of back in late 2020, and is in sort of broad terms how Breach operates today. So we have sort of an all staff circle where we discuss and make decisions on a lot of the sort of operational matters for a nonprofit. We also have a board of directors, but they've passed a resolution both supporting unionization and delegating a lot of the decision making around operations and things like that to staff, so affecting worker self-direction. And you know, we're sort of going through the sort of the final steps of the unionization process right now, but basically we'll be entering into collective bargaining in the next few months. We'll have a union committee among staff, and then they'll be negotiating directly with the board of directors to sort of set a lot of the sort of policies for self-direction, but also wages, benefits, conditions of employment, and the like. But this union contract, it's envisioned, will also recognize worker self-direction. So it'll be an additional legal protection to that board resolution that sort of bakes in this worker self-direction model into our workplace structure. And then, as you can see here, you know, we have different sort of subgroups of our staff working on different aspects of our administration and operations. We have also sort of program subgroups. So we've got this sort of communications hub that has contract and other work with different partners. We have a sort of growing climate and labour program, and then we have sort of a climate justice and liability, or sort of environment and energy circle, which includes a number of different projects. But we sort of have a broader team that's working on each of these projects, and then sort of sub teams working on different initiatives. We're also in the process of developing an advisory council. And then we also have sort of an education and propagation, which includes our law, our Organising the Green New Deal course, which is ongoing, being supported by PowerShift. We can, you know, provide information about that at the end if folks are interested. But also, you know, providing resources for unionization and other sorts of trainings. And this is very similar to how Sustainable Economies Law Centre is structured. With the key difference being that we are going to be a unionized workforce with a union committee that negotiates with the board of directors around wages, benefits, etc. That was a lot, so I'm going to pause, see if Nick has any comments or things he wants to highlight, and then for folks who are interested, we can have some questions and answers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I mean, that was great and thorough. I would say, you know, this may not be for every nonprofit. Well, I'd say one thing you'll hear from management is that some nonprofits don't need unions. So I would also always push back against that. I'm with Danny. I think every worker who wants a union should have a union, no matter what the context. We at Breach want to be movement infrastructure, like as an organization. Like we have programs that are sort of, where we administer support campaigns, and that's the thing that we know how to do. But we also really believe that different models of doing things have to spread as far as possible in order for not just sort of like on the narrow policy scale or something like that, but like as a society, in order to like make a big transition, we're going to have to democratize a lot of institutions. So I think because of that belief, we're trying to bake that into our institution, and we're doing a lot of, I don't know what the best word is for it, but like hacking existing legal structures and like tweaking them so that we're using them maybe not exactly how they've been used or intended. And so it's a little bit complicated in how we're putting that together, especially if you're taking a look at something like this for the first time. Probably can get overwhelming really quickly, but there's a logic to it when we kind of like worked out where were our limitations and degrees of freedom, and how can we set ourselves up to be like internally democratic and as useful externally as like we could possibly be to other people who are experiencing similar struggles and want to go in the same direction that we are. So yeah, this is our best effort right here. And as Danny mentioned, it's a bit technical, but the way that we envision the kind of details of this getting built out is in a like good negotiation with our board of directors through our union contract, so that we'll be developing a lot of the processes, procedures, and structures, like formalizing those through a union contract, so that they can't just be undone by a resolution by the board of directors, so that our union is there to protect it. I would say that, different unions are going to be differently receptive to participating in this kind of stuff. And we just have a great local, CWA local 7901. We think they're fabulous. And generally the Communication Workers for America are a pretty radical union that are stimulating a lot of action across the communication sector, which is a pretty broad sector. And so I think they've been really supportive of us and kind of being like, okay, yeah, you guys want to collectivize? Cool. We'll like give you whatever support we can muster, and we're there for you. So yeah, I guess as we wind it down, I would just say there is quite a bit of flexibility. There are some hard boundaries probably, but we haven't really run into them yet. Like we've been able to explore pretty much exactly what we want and figure out a way of doing that legally. And so, again, we're always helpful to discuss. We're nerds about this now. So other people who are interested at pretty much every step of what we've been talking about today, whether it's like, I just started thinking about unionizing, can you give us more information, all the way to, okay, like we're about to enter in collective bargaining and we think we might want to like bargain over the structure of our union. Like everything there, we're interested in trying to like be supportive however possible. So feel free to always ask us. I think as we mature as an organization, we're going to continue to make our resources public and tell our story about how it went. As Danny mentioned, Sustainable Economies Law Center is a great resource. They pretty much document everything and do trainings outwardly as well, and can be also useful. So I guess we'll wrap up there and see if there are any questions.
So Karina's got a question in the chat, Nick. How should board members be factored in? Have you seen specific tactics used by them to union bust? So I think there's sort of like two questions. I mean, there was two questions there, but there's sort of also two sort of underlying questions, which is, what's the role of board members and what's the experience of board members in a unionization campaign? And then I guess we can also talk a little bit about how in this in our own structure, we sort of see board members functioning and sort of what we're sort of recruiting for there. So I don't know if you want to take a go at the former.
Yeah, so it depends a lot on how your nonprofit is organized, what the articles of incorporation are like, what the formalized board duties are. But I would say, just like everything else in the political world, there's a lot of degrees of freedom. So if I'll start from the position of organizing for your union, if you have access to, which is not always the case for employees, but if you have access to your board and you have confidence that there are a couple members of your board that might be supportive of unionization, you might think about including them in your organizing strategy. And then when to include them is just a question of sort of how confident you are that they'll be supportive of your effort. So it may be after you get over, your clear majority of employees in your bargaining unit who want to signal, and you can signal something to some friendly board members before you go public, maybe. Or maybe after you make a request for voluntary recognition that you go and talk to your board members. I think in my previous union campaign, we probably would have been better served to bring a couple of board members on before we went public. And that's one of the few things that I think we maybe could have done better to affect a different outcome, but it's very contextual. And then from the perspective of what do you do with board members after you've unionized and all the rest, it really depends. We have essentially, because we started an organization from scratch, the board initially was just all the co-founders of Breach. And so, there was a lot of that people were already embracing flexibility and wanting to experiment with models and things like that. So our story is really, really easy around the board. The board's kind of yeah, we have to maintain our legal fiduciary duties, but otherwise want to give, a lot of flexibility and freedom to the organization, the staff, in order to run things. And so I don't know, we don't have the easiest probably to communicate outside of, because it's great. Basically our board's awesome, totally flexible, has already passed resolutions in support of us. And I suppose there's always a small chance that could change during collective bargaining, but I'm quite sure that it won't.
Yeah. And I would just say, yeah, and just emphasize the point, particularly on the sort of, thinking about workers wanting to unionize their nonprofits, that, that's sort of part of your power mapping as well, I guess, is sort of trying to figure out whether the board's going to be sympathetic and whether they're going to be able to sort of be an ally, or whether they're going to be another obstacle to unionization and democratization. So at my former organization, several attempts were made, I think, to sort of appeal to board members about some of the issues that we were facing prior to really the unionization campaign getting going. But sort of when push came to shove, those board members sided with management. And I think you don't want to rely on board members affecting the change, because it's just too much of a wild card. I think it's sort of it's kind of like the we protect ourselves kind of thing. You want to do as much as possible. You want to make sure that you don't have to rely on anyone else other than your former workers in your union to get the change you want. Yeah, I think I had another point on that, which is, that's right. And the other factor to consider is, there are boards that operate quite independently and are sort of selected and appointed quite independently of management. And then there's nonprofits where the executive director also sits on the board, or the executive director is also the board president. And I would definitely steer clear of the board in those latter cases, because the executive management is going to exercise too much influence on them at the end of the day. Yeah,
I mean, once the unionization effort begins and you go public, you're in a really fast moving let's call it like a competitive environment or something like that, right? Where everybody's like moving really quickly, making strategic moves, and you don't really have any control over what's going to go on in the board unless you somehow already have access to that. It's just a black box for you. And so, like Danny is saying, like if you have, the executive director either like is a part of the board, which is not a super kosher thing to do all the time. It's ill-advised according to organizations that study and advise nonprofits, but in many states it's not illegal, so it can happen. And then sometimes just through force of personality or personal relationships that your management have with the board, that can also basically lead to the same impact where they'll just sort of side with your management. If they hire union busting attorneys, the first thing that the attorneys are going to do is like cordon your board off and like make them like sign documents and things like that to not talk to you formally about anything. Which, so even if you kind of like, like, and I probably shouldn't go into too much detail, but there was some major kind of like board changes at my former nonprofit when that kind of stuff started happening, and lawyers started coming in and asking board members to sign NDAs and kind of get involved in the company line. But the point is that there's just, it's a tough situation to control. And so I think what Danny said is correct. Like if you can latch on to a friendly board member or two that you have some confidence will be an advocate for you, great. But don't make that the linchpin of your campaign, basically.
Yeah. And I would say in terms of things, the other issue with boards is that in terms of things like restructuring and other things that their sort of council that management has retained to address unionization might recommend or advise as sort of tools for undermining the power of the union. A lot of that has to be affected or signed off on by the board. So management's going to be spending a lot of time sort of focusing on trying to persuade the board to do those sorts of things, and may have sort of more direct channels of access. So yeah, I guess just as and that was sort of responding to Karina's question of whether specific tactics, I'd say, a lot of the tactics don't need board approval, but there are some sort of big ones that do need board approval. And so my general advice would just be to, if there are really sort of like staff sympathetic board members that you have really good relationships with, you may want to sort of factor them into your campaign, but generally sort of on a structural level, the board, you kind of need to be a little bit arm's length from.
Other questions that folks have? Okay, well, we should probably wrap it up then. We're about an hour, 20 minutes in. And I hope it was useful for folks who are in person and anybody who's watching, this being a recorded event. Again, we're Breach Collective. I'm Nick Caleb, and I'm joined by Danny Noonan. And our email addresses are super straightforward. It's just our names, Nick or Danny @breachcollective.org. Never hesitate to reach out. Again, it's part of our mission to help other nonprofits and workers unionize, and we'd love to help you get up to speed on how to do that. If you've got friends that you think might be interested in other places, feel free to put us in contact. This will be posted on our YouTube channel, and if you're watching this, check out the other content that we offer. We've got a lot of public education offerings that we're going to be making around both broader climate movement, climate justice, organizing, Green New Deal, and then also labor-related content. So anyway, I hope y'all are safe and good, and thanks everybody for participating. Thanks, Danny, and we will see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.